The desert air hung heavy with the promise of monsoon rains that July evening in 1998. But inside the cramped newsroom of the Phoenix Tribune, the only storm brewing was the one behind Elena Morales's dark eyes. She sat hunched over her desk, fingers dancing across the keyboard with the urgency of someone who knew time was running out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across scattered papers and empty coffee cups that had grown cold hours ago. Elena was 32, with the kind of focused intensity that made seasoned editors take notice. Her colleagues often remarked that she possessed an almost supernatural ability to find stories where others saw only silence. She wore her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her press badge hung around her neck like a talisman, a reminder of the responsibility she carried to give voice to those who had none. That evening, the newsroom had emptied except for the night shift skeleton crew. The distant hum of traffic on Interstate 10 filtered through the windows, mixing with the steady click of Elena's keyboard. She was working on what her editor, Mike Sullivan, had initially dismissed as a nothing burger, a series of incidents targeting Latino families in the outlying areas of Maricopa County. What had started as isolated reports of vandalism and threatening messages had begun to form a pattern that only Elena seemed to recognize. The story had found her through Maria Santos, a soft-spoken woman who cleaned offices downtown. Maria had approached Elena after a community meeting, her hands trembling as she described the spray-painted messages that had appeared on her family's trailer 3 times in 2 weeks. "No one listens to us," Maria had whispered, her English careful and measured. "They think we make trouble from nothing." But Elena listened. She always did. Over the past month, Elena had documented 17 similar incidents across 4 counties, broken windows with rocks wrapped in xenophobic messages, dead animals left on doorsteps, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Each incident, taken alone, could be dismissed as random cruelty. Together they painted a picture of organized intimidation that made Elena's stomach turn. Her notebook, a worn leather journal she'd carried since journalism school, was filled with names, dates, and details that law enforcement had either overlooked or chosen to ignore. Elena wrote in a mixture of English and Spanish, her thoughts flowing between languages as naturally as breathing. The notebook contained not just facts, but her observations about the fear she saw in people's eyes, the way children flinched at unexpected sounds, the exhaustion of families who slept in shifts to watch for danger. Mike had assigned her to cover a city council meeting about water rights instead. "Leave the vigilante stuff alone, Morales," he'd said that morning, not looking up from his computer. "We don't have time for conspiracy theories." But Elena knew this wasn't theory. It was happening, and it was escalating. She glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. The council meeting story could wait until tomorrow. Tonight she had a lead that couldn't. Earlier that day, she'd received a call from Father Miguel Rodriguez at St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Guadalupe. His voice was strained when he'd asked her to meet him the following evening. "There's something you need to see," he'd said, "something that ties everything together." He'd refused to say more over the phone, but the urgency in his voice had sent adrenaline coursing through Elena's veins. The church sat at the heart of one of the communities most affected by the recent incidents. If anyone would know about connections Elena had missed, it would be Father Rodriguez. The priest had served the largely Latino congregation for over 15 years, and his quiet activism had made him a trusted confidant for families afraid to speak to authorities. Eleanor saved her work and gathered her materials. Her notebook went into her leather satchel, along with her tape recorder, camera, and the manila folder containing police reports she'd obtained through Freedom of Information requests. The reports were frustratingly sparse. Most incidents were classified as vandalism or harassment, with minimal follow-up investigation. As she prepared to leave, Elena felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with pursuing a story that mattered. This wasn't just about bylines or career advancement. It was about justice for families who had no one else fighting for them. She paused at her desk, looking at a photo she kept tucked into the corner of her computer monitor. It showed her grandfather, Eduardo Morales, standing proudly in front of his small grocery store in East Phoenix. He'd immigrated from Sonora in the 1940s and built a life through determination and backbreaking work. Elena remembered sitting on his knee as a child while he told stories about the early days, when signs in shop windows read, "No dogs or Mexicans," and he'd had to prove himself worthy of basic dignity every single day. "Para la gente," she whispered, "for the people," the same words her grandfather had taught her about the importance of standing up for one's community. The parking lot was nearly empty when Elena stepped into the humid night air. Monsoon clouds gathered on the horizon, and the smell of creosote carried on the desert wind. She climbed into her silver Honda Civic, the car's interior still radiating heat from the day's scorching temperatures. As she pulled out of the lot, Elena's mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's meeting with Father Rodriguez. She had no way of knowing that she would never make it to that appointment. No way of knowing that within 24 hours, her car would be found abandoned on a remote desert road, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. No way of knowing that her leather notebook, filled with months of careful investigation and the names of families brave enough to trust her with their stories, would vanish along with her. What would you have done in her place? Would you have pursued a story that others dismissed, even when the risks became unclear? Sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that others prefer to leave untold. The last person to see Elena Morales was the security guard at her apartment complex, who waved as she drove past his booth at 11:23 p.m. The surveillance camera captured her silver Civic, disappearing into the desert darkness, carrying with it secrets that would remain buried for 20 years. Detective Ray Castillo had been with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office for 12 years when Elena Morales disappeared, long enough to recognize when a case would haunt him. The call came in on a scorching July afternoon. An abandoned vehicle found on State Route 88, about 40 miles northeast of Phoenix, where the Superstition Mountains rose from the desert floor like ancient sentinels guarding secrets. Eleanor's silver Honda Civic sat on the shoulder of the two-lane highway, hazard lights still blinking weakly. The doors were unlocked, keys dangling from the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with wallet and credit cards untouched. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder, still cool to the touch. Her cell phone lay on the dashboard, its battery drained. Ray approached the scene with the methodical attention that had made him one of the department's most respected investigators. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of saguaro cacti, palo verde trees, and rocky outcroppings that could hide 1,000 secrets. The Superstition Mountains loomed to the north, their jagged peaks creating a dramatic backdrop that tourists loved and locals respected with wary reverence. No signs of struggle, Ray noted, dictating into his recorder as he walked around the vehicle. The car's exterior showed no damage, no scratches or dents that might indicate an accident or confrontation. The interior was neat, almost pristine. Elena's journalism credentials hung from the rearview mirror, and a small wooden cross, the kind sold at Mexican markets, dangled beside them. But something was wrong. Ray could feel it in his bones, the way a lifetime desert dweller could sense a coming storm hours before clouds appeared. Elena Morales didn't strike him as the type of woman who would simply walk away from her life. Her editor at the Phoenix Tribune had described her as relentlessly responsible, the kind of reporter who confirmed appointments twice and always met her deadlines. The search began at dawn the next day. Volunteers arrived from all over the valley, members of Elena's church, colleagues from the newspaper, and dozens of families from the Latino communities she'd covered in her stories. They came carrying water bottles and hope, spreading out across the unforgiving terrain in carefully organized search lines. Ray watched them work, their determination as fierce as the desert sun. He'd seen this before, communities that law enforcement sometimes overlooked suddenly mobilizing when one of their own went missing. These weren't professional searchers, but their love for Elena transformed them into something more powerful than expertise. Among the volunteers was Elena's mother, Carmen Morales, a woman whose quiet strength reminded Ray of his own grandmother. She moved through the desert with purpose, calling her daughter's name into canyons that swallowed the sound and gave back only echoes. Carmen had driven up from Tucson the moment she'd heard about Elena's disappearance, and she refused to leave the search area even when temperatures soared past 110 degrees. She was working on something important, Carmen told Ray during one of their breaks, her voice steady despite the tears that occasionally escaped down her weathered cheeks. Elena called me 3 days ago, so excited about a story. She said she was close to something big, something that would help people. But what story? That question gnawed at Ray as days turned into weeks. Eleanor's apartment revealed a journalist's organized chaos, stacks of newspapers, filing cabinets full of research, walls covered with photographs and maps of the communities she covered. Her computer contained drafts of various articles, but nothing that seemed dangerous enough to make someone want her gone. The missing piece was her notebook. Everyone who knew Elena mentioned it, the leather journal she carried everywhere, filled with observations and contacts gathered during years of covering stories others ignored. Her colleagues described it as an extension of her arm, but it was nowhere to be found. Mike Sullivan, Eleanor's editor, met with Ray at the Tribune offices 3 weeks after the disappearance. The newsroom felt different without Eleanor's focused energy, he explained, like a symphony missing its most important instrument. She was working on something about harassment in the Latino communities, Mike said, running his hands through his graying hair. I told her to drop it, focus on city council stuff instead. Christ, I wish I'd listened to her. Ray made note of the guilt in Mike's voice, the way it seemed to weigh down his shoulders. How many people carried similar regrets? How many had dismissed Elena's concerns in the weeks before she vanished? The investigation expanded to include interviews with dozens of people Elena had contacted for her stories. Ray spoke with Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who had first approached Elena about the threatening messages. Maria wept as she described how Elena had been the first person to take her family's fears seriously. She promised to help us, Maria said in halting English. She said the truth would protect us. But what truth? Ray filled notebook after notebook with details that seemed to lead nowhere. The harassment incidents Elena had been investigating continued after her disappearance, as if her vanishing had emboldened whoever was responsible. Rocks through windows increased. More threatening calls in the night. Families began leaving the area, packing their belongings and disappearing into the vastness of America like ghosts fleeing a haunted house. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the priest Elena was supposed to meet the night she disappeared, became one of Ray's most frequent contacts. The elderly priest's eyes held secrets that Ray couldn't quite access, a sadness that went deeper than normal grief. Elena was brave, Father Rodriguez told him during one of their conversations. Perhaps too brave. She saw connections that others missed, patterns in the darkness. What kind of patterns? Ray pressed, but the priest only shook his head. Some stones are better left unturned, detective. But Elena, she believed sunlight was the best disinfectant. 6 months after Elena's disappearance, Ray sat in his truck at the spot where her car had been found, watching the sun set behind the Superstition Mountains. The official search had ended, though volunteers still came out on weekends. Elena's case had been reclassified as a missing person investigation, but Ray knew that without new evidence, it would eventually join the growing file of unsolved cases that haunted every detective's career. The desert kept its secrets well. Ray had learned that truth during his years working these lonely roads and empty spaces where people went to disappear. Sometimes by choice, sometimes not. But Elena Morales didn't feel like someone who would choose disappearance. She felt like someone who had gotten too close to something dangerous, something that couldn't afford to let her tell her story. As darkness fell over the mountains, Ray made himself a promise. He would keep Elena's case open in his heart, even if the department eventually closed it on paper. Because somewhere in this vast desert the truth was waiting, and Elena Morales deserved to have it found. 20 years passed like wind across the desert, reshaping the landscape, while leaving the deepest foundations unchanged. The Phoenix metropolitan area sprawled ever outward, subdivisions rising from former cattle ranches and citrus groves. Shopping centers replaced old neighborhoods, and the Latino communities Elena had covered either gentrified beyond recognition or faded into memory like mirages. Detective Ray Castillo retired in 2015, his hair gray and his steps slower, but Elena's case file remained in a box beside his desk at home. He'd passed the official investigation to younger detectives who approached it with professional thoroughness, but without the personal connection that had driven him for so many years. The case grew cold, then frozen, joining the thousands of missing persons who existed now only in databases and the hearts of those who remembered them. Carmen Morales aged with the stubborn grace of women who refused to surrender hope. She moved from Tucson to Phoenix in 2003, telling friends she wanted to be closer to where Elena had last been seen. But those who knew her understood the deeper truth. Carmen was maintaining a vigil, keeping watch over a mystery that law enforcement had quietly abandoned. Every year on the anniversary of Elena's disappearance, Carmen drove out to State Route 88, where her daughter's car had been found. She brought flowers, yellow roses, Elena's favorites, and stood in the desert silence, speaking to the wind in Spanish and English, never quite sure which language might reach wherever Elena had gone. The world changed around Elena's absence. The internet transformed journalism, making the kind of grassroots reporting Elena had practiced both easier and more dangerous. Social media gave voice to communities that had been voiceless in 1998, but it also provided new tools for those who preferred silence to remain unbroken. Mike Sullivan left the Phoenix Tribune in 2005, moving to Oregon, where he taught journalism at a small college. He often told his students about Elena, though he never mentioned his regret about dismissing her final story. That guilt had burrowed deep, becoming part of his DNA like scar tissue around an old wound. Father Miguel Rodriguez served his congregation until his death in 2012, taking whatever secrets he'd harbored to his grave. His replacement, Father David Martinez, inherited a community that had learned to live with unspoken fears, families who still locked their doors against dangers they couldn't name but refused to forget. The harassment incidents Elena had been investigating evolved with the times. Where once there had been rocks wrapped in threatening messages, now there were anonymous emails and social media accounts. The weapons changed, but the targeting remained consistent. Families whose primary crime was existing in spaces where others believed they didn't belong. But the desert remembers everything, even when people forget. Every flash flood carves new channels while revealing old bones. Every windstorm uncovers artifacts buried for decades. The Superstition Mountains watched over secrets with the patience of geological time, knowing that eventually everything hidden comes to light. Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who had first contacted Elena, raised her children to adulthood and saw them graduate from college, opportunities she credited to Elena's brief but fierce advocacy. Maria never forgot the young journalist who had listened when others turned away, and she taught her children to carry that memory forward, like a flame passed from one generation to the next. By 2018, Phoenix had transformed into a modern metropolis of nearly 5 million people. The downtown skyline gleamed with glass towers, and tech companies had discovered the valley's potential. But in the spaces between the growth, the forgotten neighborhoods, the rural routes leading to nowhere, the old problems persisted like desert plants that bloom only after rare rains. Ray Castillo's replacement, Detective Lisa Herrera, occasionally pulled Elena's file when other cases reminded her of the missing journalist. Lisa had joined the force in 2010, part of a new generation that approached cold cases with fresh technology and different perspectives. She'd grown up bilingual in a Phoenix that was becoming majority Latino, and Elena's story resonated with her in ways her predecessors might not have fully understood. Sometimes Lisa would drive out to State Route 88, trying to see the scene with Elena's eyes. What had drawn the journalist to this particular stretch of desert road? The highway led to Salt River Canyon and the Apache Reservation beyond, beautiful but desolate country where cell phones lost signal and help was hours away, even under the best circumstances. The Superstition Mountains had claimed other lives over the decades. Hikers who underestimated the terrain, treasure hunters chasing legends of lost gold mines, and the occasional person who simply wanted to disappear from a life that had become unbearable. But Elena hadn't been a hiker or a treasure hunter or someone fleeing her responsibilities. She'd been a journalist following a story, and stories didn't usually lead into empty desert unless something had gone terribly wrong. In quiet moments, Lisa wondered about Elena's notebook, the leather journal that everyone mentioned, but no one had ever found. What secrets had it contained? What names and connections might have made someone desperate enough to ensure Elena could never publish her findings? The questions multiplied with time rather than diminishing. Elena's disappearance had created a void that shaped everything around it, like how rivers change course around boulders. The communities she'd covered learned to live with mysteries unsolved, justice deferred, and the nagging awareness that speaking up could be dangerous in ways they couldn't predict or prepare for. Yet, life continued with its own relentless rhythm. Children grew up hearing Elena's name spoken with reverence by parents who remembered her advocacy. Young journalists found inspiration in her story, though few possessed her combination of courage and empathy. The desert cycled through its seasons of growth and dormancy, flood and drought, keeping time in ways that human calendars couldn't measure. By 2018, Elena Morales existed primarily in memory, a symbol of journalism's highest ideals and a reminder of the prices some people paid for seeking truth. Her photograph appeared occasionally in newspaper retrospectives about unsolved cases, and journalism schools sometimes used her story as a cautionary tale about the risks of investigative reporting. But symbols are fragile things, and memories fade even when love doesn't. Carmen Morales was 78 now, her visits to State Route 88 less frequent but no less meaningful. She still believed her daughter was out there somewhere, waiting to be found, still believed that truth had its own gravitational pull, bending the arc of time toward justice. The desert, patient and eternal, continued its slow work of revelation. Flash floods moved stones, exposing artifacts buried for decades. Archaeological surveys discovered pottery shards and arrowheads that told stories of earlier inhabitants. Hikers occasionally stumbled across remnants of more recent history, rusted car parts, fragments of clothing, bones that might belong to animals or might not. Everything the desert took, it eventually gave back. The question wasn't whether Elena's story would resurface. It was when and in what form, and whether anyone would still be listening when it finally broke the surface after 20 years of silence. Marcus Chen had been hiking the Superstition Wilderness for 15 years, drawn by the raw beauty of landscapes that seemed untouched by time. As a software engineer who spent most days staring at computer screens, he cherished these weekend escapes into country where the biggest challenges were reading topographical maps and carrying enough water to survive. On this particular Saturday morning in March 2018, Marcus was exploring a remote area about 12 miles from the nearest trailhead, following a faint animal path that wound between towering saguaro cacti and ancient volcanic outcroppings. The spring wildflower season had painted the desert in unexpected colors: orange poppies, purple lupine, and the delicate yellow blooms of brittlebush carpeting every available space. The monsoons the previous summer had been unusually heavy, followed by a wet winter that had transformed the typically austere landscape into something almost lush. Flash floods had carved new channels through familiar terrain, rearranging the geography that Marcus thought he knew. He was using his GPS unit to map these changes when he spotted something that didn't belong. Tucked between two massive boulders, partially hidden by a cluster of ocotillo plants, was a structure that Marcus initially mistook for a natural formation. Only when he climbed closer did he realize he was looking at human construction, a crude shelter built from desert stones and weathered wooden planks. The shack was perhaps 8 feet square and barely tall enough for an adult to stand upright. Its walls were constructed from fitted stones, mortared with what looked like mud and cement. The roof was corrugated metal, held down by larger rocks and completely rust-red from decades of weather. A single door hung askew on improvised hinges, and there were no windows, just gaps between stones that provided minimal ventilation. Marcus approached cautiously, his mind cycling through possibilities. This could be a shelter built by undocumented immigrants crossing the desert. He'd encountered such structures before, usually temporary constructions abandoned after a single use. It might be a hunting blind, though this area was too remote and rugged for most hunters. Or perhaps it was connected to the drug trafficking routes that occasionally passed through the wilderness. But something about this shack felt different. The construction was too permanent for a temporary shelter, yet too crude for a hunting cabin. The location was extraordinarily isolated. Someone would need serious determination and local knowledge to find this spot. And there was an aura of abandonment that suggested the structure had been empty for years, possibly decades. Marcus called out before approaching the door, following backcountry etiquette, even though he expected no response. The silence that answered was complete, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above. The door opened with a groan of protest, revealing an interior that made Marcus catch his breath. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a workspace, frozen in time like an archaeological site. A rough table dominated the center of the small space, constructed from boards laid across wooden crates. The walls were covered with sheets of paper, photographs, and hand-drawn maps, all held in place by nails and thumbtacks. But it was what lay on the table that made Marcus's hands shake as he reached for his camera. Among scattered papers and empty tin cans was a leather-bound notebook, its cover darkened by time and desert dust. Beside it sat a small tape recorder, the kind journalists had used before digital technology revolutionized their profession. Marcus was careful not to disturb anything as he photographed the scene. His years of hiking had taught him that discovery often came with responsibility, and something about this place suggested he'd stumbled onto more than just an abandoned shelter. This felt like a crime scene, though he couldn't articulate why. The papers on the walls appeared to be newspaper clippings and photocopied documents, many too faded by time and weather to read clearly. But Marcus could make out fragments, headlines about harassment incidents, police reports, and what looked like investigative notes written in both English and Spanish. One partially legible clipping bore a date from 1998. The notebook lay open on the table, its pages yellowed but protected from the worst weather damage by the leather cover. Marcus could see handwriting in black ink, some entries in English and others in Spanish. Names, dates, and addresses filled the visible pages, along with longer passages that appeared to be observations or interview notes. Even without touching the notebook, Marcus could read enough to understand that he discovered the workspace of a journalist. This wasn't just any abandoned shelter. This was a place where someone had been conducting serious investigative work. The isolation, the careful organization, the obvious attempt at secrecy all pointed to a story that someone had considered dangerous enough to hide in the middle of nowhere. Marcus's excitement was tempered by growing uneasiness. If a journalist had been working from this remote location 20 years ago, what had happened to them? Why had this place been abandoned with such important-looking materials left behind? And why hadn't anyone discovered it until now? The photograph that changed everything was tucked between the pages of the notebook, visible only as a corner of glossy paper. When Marcus carefully lifted the notebook's cover for a better angle, the photo slipped out and fell to the dirt floor. He picked it up, brushing off dust, and found himself looking at a professional headshot of a young Latina woman with intelligent dark eyes and a determined expression. The photo was labeled on the back in the same handwriting that filled the notebook. Elena Morales, Phoenix Tribune, 1998. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. He'd lived in Phoenix long enough to remember news coverage of missing persons, and the name Elena Morales triggered a distant memory of newspaper stories and television reports. A journalist who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind a mystery that had never been solved. But if this was Elena Morales' notebook, how had it ended up in this remote desert shack? Had she been working from this location when she disappeared? Had someone else brought her materials here? The questions multiplied faster than Marcus could process them. He spent another hour carefully photographing everything in the shack, using his phone's GPS to record exact coordinates. The structure clearly hadn't been disturbed for years. Dust covered everything, and spiderwebs stretched across corners. Whatever had happened here had happened long ago. As Marcus prepared to leave, he noticed something that had been hidden by shadows when he'd first entered. In one corner of the shack, partially covered by a piece of canvas, was a small stack of supplies: canned food, bottled water, and a flashlight. The cans were rusted but intact, and the water bottles bore labels from brands that hadn't been available for at least a decade. Someone had stocked this place for a long stay, but had never returned to use the supplies. Marcus hiked back to his truck with his mind racing, the GPS coordinates of the shack burning in his memory like a brand. He'd discovered something significant. He was certain of that much. But what exactly had he found? And what was he supposed to do with the knowledge? If this story tells you about the weight of truth waiting to be discovered, we tell stories like this every week. Stay close. By the time Marcus reached the trailhead, he'd made his decision. This discovery was bigger than anything he could handle alone. Elena Morales' notebook had been waiting 20 years for someone to find it. Now that someone had, the journalist's story deserved to finally be told. Detective Lisa Herrera received Marcus Chen's call on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Coffee growing cold while she reviewed case files, the familiar rhythm of a detective's life measured in reports and follow-up calls. But Marcus's carefully worded description of his desert discovery changed the tenor of her entire day. "I found some kind of shelter out in the superstitions," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who understood the significance of what he'd stumbled upon. "There's a notebook inside, and photographs, and it's all labeled with the name Elena Morales from 1998. Lisa felt electricity course through her veins. She'd reviewed Elena's case file dozens of times over the years, always wondering if she was missing something crucial. The missing journalist's story had become one of those cases that haunted the department, not because of any dramatic circumstances, but because of its very ordinariness. Elena had simply vanished, leaving behind more questions than answers. Within 2 hours, Lisa was driving through the desert toward the coordinates Marcus had provided, accompanied by a small team that included a crime scene photographer and evidence technician. The route took them deep into country that most Phoenix residents never saw, wild lands where saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, and the city's sprawl seemed as distant as another planet. Marcus met them at the trailhead, carrying a detailed topographical map marked with the precise location of his discovery. He led them through terrain that grew progressively more challenging, over rocky washes and between massive boulders that had tumbled from the surrounding peaks eons ago. "I almost missed it," Marcus explained as they hiked. "The monsoons last summer changed a lot of the landscape, exposed things that had been hidden. This place was tucked away where you'd never see it unless you were looking specifically." When they reached the stone shack, Lisa understood immediately why it had remained undiscovered for 2 decades. The structure was virtually invisible from any direction, except the exact approach Marcus had taken, hidden by natural rock formations and desert vegetation that had grown up around it over the years. Lisa approached the scene with the methodical care of someone who understood that every detail mattered. She photographed the exterior from multiple angles before stepping inside, documenting the layout and condition of everything Marcus had described. The notebook lay exactly as Marcus had left it, open on the makeshift table like a book interrupted mid-sentence. Lisa could see Elena's handwriting clearly, precise journalistic notes interspersed with personal observations that revealed the person behind the professional facade. "July 15th, 1998, one entry read in Elena's careful script. "Maria Santos called again. Says the harassment is escalating. Someone left a dead cat on her doorstep last night with a note. Go home, where you belong. Police report filed but minimal follow-up expected." Lisa continued reading, each entry painting a picture of Elena's investigation into what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of intimidation targeting Latino families across multiple communities. Names, dates, incident reports, all meticulously documented in Elena's distinctive handwriting. But it was the later entries that made Lisa's blood run cold. July 18th, 1998. Pattern is definitely coordinated. Same phrases appearing in multiple locations, similar tactics. Timing suggests central organization. Father Rodriguez says he has information that could tie everything together, meeting him tomorrow night. That was the meeting Elena had never made, the appointment that was supposed to take place the evening she disappeared. July 19th, 1998. Something is wrong. Phone calls hanging up when I answer. Car followed me home from the office. Mike wants me to drop the story, but I'm too close now. The families are counting on me. Lisa felt the weight of Elena's final entries like a physical presence in the small space. The journalist had known she was in danger, but had continued working, driven by a sense of responsibility that had ultimately led to her disappearance. The walls of the shack told their own story. Elena had covered every available surface with her research materials, photocopies of police reports, newspaper clippings about harassment incidents, photographs of vandalized homes and businesses. It was the workspace of someone conducting serious investigative journalism under conditions of extreme secrecy. But why here? Why had Elena chosen this remote location for her work? And how had she even known this place existed? The answer came in the form of a hand-drawn map tucked between the notebook's pages. Elena had sketched the route to the shack with the precision of someone who'd made the journey multiple times, including landmarks and GPS coordinates written in her careful script. Safe house, she'd written at the bottom of the map. No cell service, no witnesses, no interruptions. Lisa realized she was looking at Elena's attempt to create a secure location for her investigation, a place where she could work without fear of surveillance or interference. The journalist had been more aware of the dangers she faced than anyone had known. The crime scene team worked for hours, cataloging every piece of evidence in the small space. Elena's tape recorder contained interviews with harassment victims, their voices preserved like messages in a bottle cast into an ocean of time. The sound quality was poor after 20 years, but the fear in people's voices came through clearly. Among Elena's papers, Lisa found copies of police reports she recognized from the original missing person investigation. But Elena had annotated these reports with her own observations, connecting dots that law enforcement had missed or ignored. Officer Martinez, related to suspect, Elena had written beside one report. Same surname, same neighborhood. Conflict of interest. 3 incidents same weekend. Coordination appeared beside another report. Check phone records, look for common contacts. Eleanor had been conducting the kind of thorough investigation that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about the harassment campaign and potentially about law enforcement's response to it, or lack thereof. But the most chilling discovery was Elena's final entry, dated July 20th, 1998, the day she disappeared. They know about the shack, she'd written in handwriting that looked hurried, almost frantic. Saw vehicle parked at Trailhead yesterday, same truck that followed me last week. Moving essential documents tonight. If something happens to me, look for Father Rodriguez. He has the missing piece. Lisa stared at those words, feeling the chill of recognition. Elena had known her investigation had been compromised. She'd known someone was watching her, tracking her movements, aware of her secret workspace. The journalist had tried to protect her research by moving it, but she'd never had the chance, which meant someone else had brought Elena's materials to this place after her disappearance. Lisa looked around the shack with new eyes, seeing it not as Elena's workplace but as someone else's attempt to hide evidence. The supplies in the corner, the careful organization of materials, the remote location, all of it suggested that someone had used this place as a storage site for materials they couldn't afford to have discovered. But who? And why had they abandoned everything here instead of destroying it? The investigation that Elena had died pursuing was still here, waiting 20 years later for someone to finish what she'd started. Every name in her notebook, every connection she'd traced, every piece of evidence she'd gathered, all of it preserved by desert air and someone's decision to hide rather than destroy. Lisa carefully closed Elena's notebook, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was an active investigation with fresh evidence and new questions. Elena's story wasn't over. It had simply been waiting for someone to continue reading from where she'd been forced to stop. The desert had kept Elena's secrets for 20 years. Now it was time to see if those secrets could finally reveal the truth about what had happened to the journalist, who'd refused to look away when others preferred silence. Lisa Herrera spent sleepless nights in the weeks following the shack discovery. Elena's notebook spread across her kitchen table, like a map to buried treasure. Each page revealed new layers of the investigation Elena had been conducting, a systematic documentation of harassment, intimidation, and violence targeting Latino families across the Phoenix metropolitan area in 1998. The scope of Elena's work was staggering. She'd identified 47 separate incidents over an 8-month period, spanning multiple law enforcement jurisdictions. What had appeared to be random acts of vandalism and threats revealed themselves, through Elena's meticulous research, as a coordinated campaign designed to terrorize specific communities into leaving. But it was the connections Elena had discovered that made Lisa's stomach turn. 3 names appeared repeatedly in Elena's notes: Frank Morrison, a construction foreman who owned property in several of the targeted neighborhoods; Deputy Bill Henderson, who had responded to multiple harassment reports with what Elena documented as deliberate indifference; and Robert Castillo, a local businessman who'd made several offers to purchase homes in areas where families were being harassed. Elena had drawn connections between these men that painted a disturbing picture. Morrison's construction company had been hired for several suspicious projects in targeted neighborhoods, always after families had been driven out by harassment. Henderson had consistently minimized or ignored reports from Latino families, while fast-tracking investigations when similar incidents affected white residents. Castillo's property acquisitions followed a pattern. He made low-ball offers to harassment victims, then purchased their homes for significantly below market value when families fled. "It's economic terrorism," Elena had written in one of her final entries. "Create fear, drive out residents, acquire property cheap, then develop for profit. Perfect crime because victims disappear rather than fight back." Lisa cross-referenced Elena's notes with property records from 1998 and 1999, finding that Morrison's construction company had indeed worked on multiple projects in areas where harassment had been most severe. The timeline was damning. Families reported threats and vandalism, then sold their homes to Castillo's shell companies at prices far below market value. Then Morrison's crews began construction on new developments within months. But Elena had discovered something more than a real estate scheme. Her notes contained references to meetings, phone calls, and coordination between the 3 men that suggested a level of organization far beyond opportunistic profiteering. July 10, 1998, confirmed Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo met at Sunset Country Club 3 times in past month. Member records show they're not regular golfers. What were they discussing? July 12, 1998. Henderson's patrol routes coincide with harassment incidents 87% of the time, either incredible bad luck or deliberate positioning to control police response. July 16, 1998. Castillo's real estate offers made within 48 hours of most serious threats. How does he know which families will be ready to sell? Elena had been building a case for conspiracy, 3 men using intimidation, corruption, and violence to systematically displace Latino families for financial gain. But she'd needed proof that would stand up in court, evidence that connected the dots beyond circumstantial correlation. That evidence, according to Elena's notes, was supposed to come from Father Miguel Rodriguez. Lisa had read the priest's name dozens of times in Elena's notebook, always in the context of someone who possessed crucial information but was reluctant to share it. Elena's final entries mentioned multiple attempts to convince Father Rodriguez to go on the record with whatever he knew. "Father Rodriguez is terrified," Elena had written, "says speaking out will put his entire congregation at risk, but he's the only one who can tie everything together. He knows something about these men that he won't tell me over the phone." Father Rodriguez had been dead for 6 years, taking his secrets to the grave. But Lisa wondered if the priest might have left some record, some document that could complete Elena's investigation. St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Guadalupe looked much the same as it had in 1998, though the neighborhood around it had changed dramatically. Gentrification had transformed many of the modest homes Elena had written about into expensive renovations. their original families long gone. Father David Martinez, who'd replaced Father Rodriguez, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd served the congregation for 8 years. When Lisa showed him Elena's notebook and explained the connection to his predecessor, Father Martinez's expression grew troubled. "Father Rodriguez talked about Elena sometimes," he said, his voice careful and measured. "He carried a great deal of guilt about her disappearance, said he should have acted sooner, should have been braver." Lisa pressed gently for details, but Father Martinez claimed limited knowledge of events from before his arrival. However, he did remember Father Rodriguez mentioning a confession that had haunted him for years. He said someone had confessed to terrible things, but the seal of confession prevented him from speaking out. It tormented him that he couldn't help bring justice even when an innocent woman's life was at stake. The implications were staggering. If Father Rodriguez had heard a confession related to the harassment campaign or Elena's disappearance, his silence would have been guaranteed by church law. But had he found some way to preserve that information without violating his sacred obligations? Father Martinez led Lisa through the church's modest offices, explaining that Father Rodriguez had been meticulous about record-keeping. His files contained decades of parish business, correspondence, and personal notes about his ministry. "I've never gone through everything," Father Martinez admitted. "Some of it felt too personal, too private. But if you think it might help solve Elena's case..." They found Father Rodriguez's private papers in a filing cabinet in his former office, now used for storage. Years of sermons, personal correspondence, and theological reflections filled several boxes. But tucked in the back of the bottom drawer was a manila envelope marked with a single word: Elena. Inside were copies of police reports, newspaper clippings about harassment incidents, and a letter that made Lisa's hands shake as she read it. "To whoever finds this," Father Rodriguez had written in his careful script, "I am bound by sacred vows from speaking directly about what I know regarding Elena Morales' investigation and disappearance, but I cannot remain silent while evil goes unpunished." The letter was dated 2 weeks after Elena vanished. A member of my congregation confessed to participating in activities designed to drive Latino families from their homes. He told me of meetings, of plans, of violence committed and violence planned. He named names, including men in positions of authority who perverted their oaths to serve justice. Father Rodriguez had found a way to honor his vows while preserving Elena's work. He couldn't break the seal of confession, but he could document what Elena had already discovered through her own investigation, adding details that only someone with inside knowledge could provide. The confession revealed that Elena's investigation was known to those she was investigating. They had been watching her, following her, aware of her secret workspace in the desert. When they realized how close she was to exposing them, they acted to silence her permanently. Lisa felt the blood drain from her face as she continued reading. Elena was murdered on July 20, 1998, by persons known to me through confession, but whom I cannot name directly. Her body was disposed of in a manner that would prevent discovery. Her notebook and research materials were moved to the desert shack to make it appear she had been working alone in isolation, should anyone ever find them. The priest's letter continued with details that corroborated Elena's investigation, specific incidents, dates, and methods used to terrorize families. But it also revealed the corruption that had protected the perpetrators for 20 years. Deputy Henderson was not merely negligent in his response to harassment reports. He was an active participant, using his position to intimidate victims and discourage them from pursuing complaints. When Elena's investigation threatened to expose the conspiracy, Henderson used his law enforcement connections to track her movements and report her activities to his co-conspirators. Lisa realized she was holding evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond real estate fraud. This was murder, corruption, and civil rights violations on a scale that would shake the entire law enforcement community if proven. But Father Rodriguez's letter also contained a warning that chilled Lisa to her core. Those responsible for Elena's death remain in positions of power and influence. They have spent 20 years believing their secret was safe. Anyone who attempts to revive Elena's investigation will face the same dangers she encountered. I pray that justice will eventually prevail, but I fear for anyone brave enough to seek it. Lisa sat in the quiet church office, holding evidence that could finally solve Elena's case, while simultaneously understanding the risks that came with pursuing it. Elena had died because she'd gotten too close to powerful people who couldn't afford to have their activities exposed. Now, Lisa possessed the same dangerous knowledge. But Elena's story deserved to be told. The families who'd been terrorized deserved justice, and somewhere in the desert, Elena's remains were waiting to be found and given the dignity of proper burial. Father Rodriguez had preserved Elena's investigation through 20 years of silence. Now it was time to see if the truth Elena had died pursuing could finally see the light of day. Lisa Herrera faced a dilemma that kept her awake for weeks after discovering Father Rodriguez's letter. The evidence she possessed could potentially solve Elena's murder and expose a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for 2 decades. But the same evidence also revealed how dangerous pursuing this investigation could be. Deputy Bill Henderson had retired from the sheriff's office in 2010 with full honors, receiving commendations for his years of service. Frank Morrison's construction company had grown into one of the most successful development firms in the Phoenix area, responsible for several major housing projects. Robert Castillo had parlayed his real estate investments into a small empire, serving on various city planning committees and business boards. All 3 men had spent 20 years building legitimate public personas, while Elena's murder faded into the cold case files. They'd constructed lives and careers on a foundation of violence and corruption, believing their secret was buried as deeply as Elena herself. Lisa knew that pursuing them would require evidence beyond Father Rodriguez's letter and Elena's notebook. Accusations against prominent community members needed ironclad proof, especially when those accusations involved murder and conspiracy. She began working quietly, researching the 3 men's activities and associations during the relevant time period. What she discovered was a pattern of connections that supported Elena's investigation. Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo had maintained business and social relationships throughout the years since Elena's disappearance. They belonged to the same country club, attended the same charity events, and their companies had worked together on multiple projects. But most damning was what Lisa found in property records from 1998 and 1999. In the 12 months following Elena's disappearance, Castillo's companies had purchased 17 properties in areas where harassment had been reported. Morrison's construction firm had then developed those properties into high-end housing that sold for 3 times what Castillo had paid for the original lots. The scheme had been hugely profitable, generating millions in revenue that had funded both men's subsequent business expansion. Henderson had left law enforcement in 2010 to join Castillo's companies as a security consultant, his pension supplemented by a salary that seemed excessive for someone whose primary qualification was 25 years of police work. Lisa also discovered that the harassment Elena had documented hadn't ended with her disappearance. It had simply become more sophisticated. Instead of rocks through windows and threatening phone calls, the intimidation had evolved into code enforcement harassment, selective prosecution of minor infractions, and economic pressure applied through business licensing and permitting processes. The methods had changed, but the goal remained the same: driving out residents whose presence interfered with development plans. Lisa's investigation took on new urgency when she realized the conspiracy might still be active. Neighborhoods throughout the Phoenix area were experiencing patterns of harassment and displacement that echoed what Elena had documented 20 years earlier. The players had aged and their methods had evolved, but the fundamental strategy of using fear to force out unwanted residents remained unchanged. But building a case against Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo would require more than circumstantial evidence and historical patterns. Lisa needed concrete proof of their involvement in Elena's murder, and that proof likely rested with Elena's remains. Father Rodriguez's letter had contained one final crucial detail. The confessor had provided specific information about where Elena's body had been disposed of. The priest couldn't reveal this information directly without violating his sacred vows, but he'd found another way to preserve it. The location can be found by following Elena's own map, Father Rodriguez had written cryptically. She documented a place that held significance for her family's history. The answer lies in her notebook, in the margin notes she made about her grandfather's stories. Lisa returned to Elena's notebook with fresh eyes, looking for references to family history or locations that might hold personal significance. She found what she was looking for in an entry from early July 1998, barely legible notes written in the margin beside an interview with a harassment victim. "Like Abuelo's mine," Elena had written. "Same mountains, same hatred, different generation." Lisa remembered the photograph in Elena's apartment. Her grandfather Eduardo standing proudly in front of his grocery store. Elena had mentioned during the original missing person investigation that her grandfather had worked in copper mines before opening his store, mining claims somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. A trip to the county recorder's office revealed that Eduardo Morales had indeed owned mining claims in the Superstitions during the 1940s and 1950s. The claims had been abandoned when copper prices fell, but the locations were still on file. A series of small excavations in remote canyons about 15 miles from where Elena's car had been found. If Father Rodriguez's letter was accurate, Elena's killers had disposed of her body in a location that held meaning for her family. A cruel irony that connected her death to her grandfather's struggles against the same kind of prejudice that had ultimately cost Elena her life. Lisa organized a search of the abandoned mining claims, bringing cadaver dogs and forensic specialists to locations that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The desert had reclaimed most evidence of Eduardo's mining operations, but the dogs identified areas of interest in two different sites. The first excavation revealed nothing but old mining debris and animal bones, but the second site, a narrow canyon hidden between towering rock walls, told a different story. 20 feet down in what had once been a mining shaft, wrapped in canvas and buried under decades of desert debris, they found Elena Morales. Her remains were remarkably well preserved by the dry desert air and protected location. She was still wearing the clothes witnesses had last seen her in, jeans, a white blouse, and the small silver cross necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. But it was what they found with Elena that provided the final piece of evidence Lisa needed. Elena's purse contained items that hadn't been in her car when it was found: her driver's license, credit cards, and a small cassette tape labeled "Insurance." The tape contained Elena's voice, recorded on the day she disappeared, summarizing her investigation and naming Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo as the subjects of her story. "If something happens to me," Elena's voice said through 20 years of static, "these are the men responsible. They've built their success on terrorizing families who can't fight back, but I can fight back and I will." The cassette also contained portions of Elena's interview with Father Rodriguez, recorded the afternoon before she disappeared. The priest's voice was barely audible, but his words were clear enough to understand. "They confessed to me," Father Rodriguez said on the tape. "All three of them, thinking their sins would be kept secret. But Elena, some secrets are too dangerous to keep." Lisa had the evidence she needed to seek murder charges against three men who'd believed they were beyond justice. But she also understood why Father Rodriguez had been terrified, why Eleanor had hidden her investigation in a remote desert shack, and why pursuing this case had cost the journalist her life. The conspiracy Elena had uncovered wasn't just about real estate fraud or even murder. It was about a system that protected those in power while abandoning those who couldn't defend themselves. Exposing Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo would require challenging that system, confronting the very institutions that had allowed them to operate with impunity for 2 decades. But Elena's voice on that cassette tape, preserved through 20 years of desert silence, gave Lisa the courage she needed. Elena had known the risks and pursued justice anyway. Now it was time to see if that justice could finally be delivered. The investigation that had cost Elena Morales her life was about to reach its conclusion. The only question was whether the system Elena had died trying to expose would finally be forced to confront the truth about itself. The arrests came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in November 2018, 20 years and 4 months after Elena Morales had driven into the desert for the last time. Lisa Herrera had spent months building an airtight case, coordinating with federal prosecutors who understood that this investigation touched on civil rights violations that transcended local jurisdiction. Frank Morrison was taken into custody at his Scottsdale home, a sprawling estate built with profits from the development projects that had followed Elena's murder. The construction magnate, now 73 and gray-haired, seemed genuinely shocked that anyone was still investigating events from 2 decades past. Robert Castillo was arrested at his office in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by the real estate empire he'd built on a foundation of intimidation and violence. At 68, he'd grown comfortable with the respect that came with wealth and civic involvement, never expecting that his carefully constructed reputation would crumble in a single morning. Bill Henderson proved the most difficult to locate. The former deputy had grown paranoid in recent years, perhaps sensing that his past was finally catching up with him. When federal agents found him at a cabin in Flagstaff, he was packed and ready to run, his truck loaded with cash and supplies for an extended absence. The news broke like a thunderstorm across Arizona, dominating headlines and social media feeds. 3 prominent men charged in 1998, murder of journalist Elena Morales. The story that Elena had died trying to tell was finally being heard, 20 years after her voice had been silenced. Carmen Morales, now 80, watched the news coverage from her Phoenix apartment, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She'd never stopped believing that Elena's killers would eventually face justice, but seeing their faces on television still felt surreal after 2 decades of waiting. Elena knew, Carmen told reporters who gathered outside her building. She knew they were dangerous men, but she believed truth was stronger than fear. Today, she was proven right. The trial began 8 months later, drawing national attention from journalists who understood that Elena's case represented something larger than a single murder. This was about the price of investigative reporting, the vulnerability of those who speak truth to power, and the corruption that thrives in darkness. Lisa testified for 3 days, walking the jury through Eleanor's investigation step by step. She read from the journalist's notebook, played portions of Elena's recorded interviews, and explained how 20 years of detective work had finally connected all the pieces Elena had identified before her death. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Property records, financial documents, and witness testimony painted a clear picture of the conspiracy Elena had uncovered. Morrison, Henderson, and Castillo had systematically terrorized Latino families to acquire their property cheaply, using Henderson's law enforcement position to prevent investigation and Morrison's construction expertise to maximize profits from development. But it was Father Rodriguez's letter and Elena's final cassette recording that provided the most damning evidence. The priest's words, preserved in writing because his sacred vows prevented direct testimony, revealed the confessions he'd heard from all three defendants. Elena's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, named her killers with a clarity that 20 years couldn't diminish. The defense attorneys attempted various strategies, claiming their clients were being scapegoated for systemic problems, arguing that evidence discovered after 20 years couldn't be trusted, suggesting that Elena's investigation had been flawed or biased. But the accumulated weight of evidence was crushing. Henderson broke first, agreeing to testify against his co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and the calculation behind Elena's murder. "She was going to destroy everything we'd built," Henderson said from the witness stand, his voice barely audible. Morrison and Castillo had invested everything in those development projects. Eleanor's story would have exposed the whole operation, sent us all to prison, ruined families who depended on our businesses. The decision to kill Elena hadn't been made lightly, Henderson explained. They'd tried other methods first, having her followed, attempting to discredit her investigation, pressuring her editor to kill the story. But Elena had been too determined, too thorough in her research. "We knew about her secret workspace," Henderson continued. "I'd tracked her there using police resources, confirmed she was building a case against us. When she scheduled that meeting with Father Rodriguez, we realized she was about to get the final evidence she needed." The murder itself had been carefully planned. Henderson had used his law enforcement contacts to monitor Elena's movements, while Morrison and Castillo had prepared the remote location where her body would be hidden. They'd intercepted Elena on her way to meet Father Rodriguez, forcing her car off the road at gunpoint. "We thought if we moved her research materials to that desert shack, made it look like she'd been working alone out there, people would assume she'd gotten lost or had an accident," Henderson said. "We never expected anyone to find that place." But Eleanor had been too smart, too careful in her documentation. Even in death, her investigation had preserved the evidence needed to bring her killers to justice. Morrison and Castillo were convicted on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and racketeering. Henderson received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, but would still spend the rest of his life in prison. All three men, who'd lived 20 years believing they were beyond consequences, faced the reality that Elena's story had finally been told. The convictions sent shockwaves through Arizona's law enforcement and business communities. Other cases were reopened, other patterns of harassment and displacement re-examined. Elena's investigation, completed posthumously, had revealed corruption that extended far beyond three men's greed. Carmen Morales attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with Elena's photograph in her lap. When the verdicts were read, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in Spanish, gratitude for justice, delayed, but not denied. Elena's remains were finally laid to rest in a cemetery overlooking the desert she'd loved, surrounded by family and colleagues who'd never forgotten her courage. The headstone bore a simple inscription: Elena Morales, 1966-1998. She spoke for those who had no voice. But Elena's real memorial was the change her story inspired. Journalism schools began teaching her case as an example of investigative reporting's risks and rewards. Law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols for investigating harassment targeting immigrant communities. and families throughout Arizona learned that someone had cared enough to die, defending their right to live without fear. The desert shack where Marcus Chen had discovered Elena's notebook was preserved as an unofficial memorial, visited by journalists and activists who understood that truth, however long delayed, eventually surfaces. Like water finding its way through limestone, justice had carved its own path through 20 years of silence and denial. Elena Morales had been murdered for pursuing a story about hate and greed masquerading as legitimate business. But her death had ultimately exposed a larger truth, that courage is contagious, that justice has its own timeline, and that some stories are too important to remain untold, no matter the cost. The young journalist who disappeared into the desert darkness in 1998 had finally come home, bringing with her the evidence needed to illuminate truths that others had tried to bury forever. In the end, Elena's story proved that even death couldn't silence a voice raised in defense of justice. The notebook that had waited 20 years in a stone shack was donated to the Arizona Historical Society, where journalism students could read Elena's words and understand the responsibility that came with seeking truth. Her investigation, completed by Detective Lisa Herrera, and Father Rodriguez's courage, had shown that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too important to let die with those who discover them. Elena Morales had found her story, and finally her story had found its ending.